So let's talk about why Wraith Knights and Windows are perhaps somewhat problematic for Warhammer 40k 10th edition. Let's discuss the towering rule and its effect on the game. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about one rule that looks like it's having perhaps a surprisingly big effect on the game of Warhammer 40k, and why it might potentially be a problem that Games Workshop could do with fixing at some point sooner or later. The main issue that with the rule as it stands, some tables are just going to be absolute easy shooting galleries for really big things like Imperial Knights, Wraith Knights and other super heavies, whereas some tables with very slightly different terrain might actually punish them quite hard, and it's kind of impossible to balance for both. The main weirdness comes around how really big things interact with the obscuring rule, the rule that Games Workshop introduced in 9th edition that basically meant that you couldn't shoot from one side of a ruin straight through the ruin and all the way out to the other side and hit whatever's cowering behind it. In both 9th edition and 10th edition, that rule basically would block line of sight to most things, but certain things were excluded. Things with 18 wounds or more in 9th edition or aircraft couldn't benefit from it, even though they might be fighting against something that could hide behind obscuring. So it did create some situations where, say, the big Titanic Knight could be shot by an enemy unit but couldn't shoot back. In general, it definitely does feel a bit weird when one unit can just directly see and shoot a unit, but somehow the other one can't return fire directly. So perhaps due to this, Games Workshop decided to redesign the new towering rule for 10th edition, a keyword that certain units have, but not all Titanic units, and not all big things. It's not just about some arbitrary wound cap anymore. The big change in 10th edition is that these towering units basically get to shoot straight through ruins provided they can draw a line of sight physically to their foe. For these units, the obscuring ruins type rule just doesn't really exist, either positively or negatively. Even if you're behind ruins, you can both be shot by them, but also shoot them too. I feel like on paper that does really kind of sound fair enough. You're neither benefiting nor losing out from the rule, so in theory it shouldn't really be too much of a problem. In reality though, I think it can feel kind of janky to play either with or against it, and perhaps the reason goes back to the reason that obscuring ruins were introduced in the first place. In general, in Warhammer 40k, visibility is determined by true line of sight, what you can shoot and be shot by, any part of the model to any other part of the model. In games of Warhammer 40k though, lots of Games Workshop and other suppliers make terrain pieces like this one with a big ruin with a bunch of windows in it, perhaps one of the most common terrain pieces that you might see on a gaming board, and if you purely just go by true line of sight, then they just don't really block anything very well. In 8th edition, when Games Workshop did their big reset, nothing in the core rules prevented you from drawing a true line of sight through multiple small gaps in lots of different ruins across from one side of the board to the other. It just meant that if you had any ruin with at least a reasonable amount of windows in, you'd very rarely ever be able to hide anything in it, and you might turn up to a game of Warhammer 40k, put down your models in your deployment zone, and basically your opponent's big guns, if they got first turn, could just draw line of sight and just blow up whatever they wanted to, and deal some fairly maximal damage provided they had range. It gave big advantages to the player going first, and terrain in general just wasn't really super meaningful. It generally didn't matter too much whether you had a lot of it or not so much if you were going by the core rules, because it just didn't do very much. The problem was generally considered so bad by independent tournament organisers that a lot of people house-ruled Games Workshop's rule set in one way or another. Say, for example, the ITC had the rule where the ground floor always blocks line of sight. That generally worked kind of well and meant that players' armies could be somewhat protected from the big alpha strikes that 40k is sort of known for. And Games Workshop basically adopted a fairly good idea and made the ruins a lot more meaningful, with the obscuring rule meaning that they blocked line of sight. Now in 10th edition, at least for the most part, it works kind of similarly, except of course for the towering rule, which kind of just completely removes this rule for certain armies. Obviously the big examples are things like Imperial Knights and Chaos Knights in particular, both really quite scary with enormous big gun stat lines at the moment. Eldar Wraith Knights certainly seem to be one of the most feared examples at the moment as well, with those ridiculous D-cannons with all the mortal wounds. But as 10th edition unfolds, it seems like it'd be a similar problem whenever a ranged super heavy gets kind of strong. On a lot of game boards, there's just going to be absolutely no hiding from them. They're going to be able to shoot what they want, including really valuable stuff that you might want to hide at the back of your army. In theory, if all game boards were kind of similar, then they could still theoretically be balanced, just charge more points for them. In general, it tends to work out okay for barrage weapons that generally cost a few more points for the indirect fire privilege, plus also take further penalties if they fire at units out of line of sight. It definitely still seems to be possible to have super heavies that are kind of weak or a bit underwhelming in 40k 10th. Say for example the Orc Stomper still seems overcosted. That's got the towering rule but isn't really going to be a problem at 800 points for its damage output. In theory, it should mean that there'd be a fairly happy medium for some of the other Titanic units out there as well if they just went up in points a bit. Even then, it still might be a little bit hard to get things right. It's almost kind of like having barrage weapon type abilities on some of the most dangerous guns on the biggest units around. Maybe not the easiest thing to make both not too weak and also not overpowered. I'd say perhaps the biggest issue with towering terrain, though, is the variations of terrain that you might get that different people play on. Perhaps in particular, the ruins and terrain features that you have, either having windows or not having windows. Lots of tournament terrain often tends not to, as it generally blocks line of sight a bit better, and it just kind of means that you can't really balance towering units particularly well for both cases. If you're playing on a table with a whole bunch of windows and ruins that would usually work as good obscuring terrain against most armies, towering units are going to have an absolute field day just shooting up what they want. But if they happen to arrive on the same table, and some enterprising Imperial citizen or Chaos cultist has been around and boarded up all those windows, they might actually be a bit underpowered if they paid a points premium for their towering rule, and they'll have a bit of a nightmare trying to catch up with the rest of the enemy army as it skitters around all the terrain and gets the jump on them. Admittedly, having different terrains always going to change the balance of power. For example, absolutely tons of dense terrain will help out assault armies, and big wide open fields will help ranged armies. Still, though, I feel like this is just such a weird and arbitrary binary decision of whether or not windows are open or not, that it just feels like a bit of a silly thing for it to determine the power of certain armies like Imperial Knights quite so much. It kind of feels like this is the situation that obscuring terrain rule was sort of supposed to fix, but Games Workshop has sort of rolled it back a bit by having it not apply to certain units in a very big way. I'll certainly be interested to hear your thoughts on the towering rule, particularly any in-game experiences you've had in early 10th edition. If you've played against any of the good towering super heavies like Wraith Knights or say Imperial Knight Crusaders and things, how has it impacted the game, and do you think it's a problem that needs fixing? I think personally it does look a bit problematic. As mentioned, I just don't really like the way it makes such a big difference between things like shorter ruins with windows and taller ruins without. And on the flip side, having towering units either be kind of overpowered in certain games with the former and kind of underpowered with the latter. Probably not the best thing in the world for alpha strikes as well, if everyone can just see everyone in certain matchups. Having enough terrain that can adequately hide your armies on the board is kind of important for that, and not just having one side gone off the board. In terms of what they could do to fix it, I'm not entirely sure whether they'd necessarily want to, as it is a clear part of the core rules. I guess they could always FAQ or update it though in a balance pass. Maybe some possibilities are that the towering units could perhaps see over bits of terrain like that, but maybe not see through gaps like windows. That'll still give it some extra powerful rule if they can actually tower over the terrain rather than just look through it, and it means that the opponent might be able to hide certain shorter models that are close to the ruin. Otherwise, I guess they could maybe do something like the barrage debuff that gives you a -1 to hit, and also the opponent the benefit of cover if you fire out of line of sight. That kind of feels at least somewhat analogous to this, really. And I guess that could make towering units just a little bit less efficient if they're firing straight through ruins and out the other side, as opposed to actually gunning down things that they can actually see. In any case, as I mentioned, I look forward to hearing your thoughts on it. Do you think that it's a problem for 40k? And if so, how might Games Workshop go about fixing it? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, while certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, then I'd just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description below if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons are what allow me to keep these videos coming quite so regularly, so if you are enjoying a lot, then any support is massively appreciated. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.